All right, U.S. history back at it today with the JFK administration. So that is right. We are all the way up to John F. Kennedy. We're going to be talking about his presidency today. It was a very short presidency, but boy, it was eventful. And as most of you guys already know, it ends with the conspiracy theory of his assassination and what actually happened and why was he assassinated and all that. We're not going to get to the assassination today. That will be next class. But today we are going to talk about his time in presidency, which was filled with drama. All right. From the very beginning, it is filled with drama. The election of 1960 between him and Richard Nixon, which is probably another name that you guys recognize because he will go on to become president as well later, was a lot of firsts. Okay. First off, TV for the first time played a huge role in this election. Okay. They had a famous debate where JFK and Richard Nixon debated each other on the airwaves, and millions of people paid attention and tuned in that night for the debate. And the dividing factor, at least how it went down in history, is that JFK looked more youthful. JFK looked more calm. JFK looked like he just had a little bit more looseness to him. And Richard Nixon seemed very uptight, and he seemed kind of off, and he seemed kind of rigid. And the Americans that tuned in that night really kind of like favored the way that JFK looked on television. I mean, one, he's a very good looking guy, all right? Probably, one of the best looking presidents we've ever had. I'm not sure how much competition he has with that, but thinking back, let me think about some attractive presidents. This is a weird path to go down, guys, but I'm going to go down it. Teddy Roosevelt, he had a very like ruggedness to him, like a rugged handsomeness to him. Other good looking, Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he's tall, tall, dark, handsome. Maybe I don't know, but yeah, let's get off of that. Okay. Anyway, yeah, a lot of firsts. That's what I was talking about. TV plays a huge role for the first time. Let's talk about the first when JFK was elected. One, it was a super close race. Okay, the election of 1960 was the closest since 1884. That is a long time since we had an election this close. And then once he's elected, here's a few things that maybe you didn't know. Let's start from the bottom. I read 1,600 words a minute. That's really fast, but I can't really tell you how fast that is. But the firsts of him, right? This is a weird lecture going on here, but I mean maybe this is better for you guys because it's maybe making you pay attention more. But yeah, let's keep it going. He was the first Roman Catholic president. He was also the youngest president ever elected, and the first president ever born in the 20th century to be elected. So all of these firsts with JFK becoming president, a couple things maybe you didn't know about him. He was a naval officer in World War II, so he did have some war background. Also was a Pulitzer Prize author, writing profiles in courage, and served exactly 1,000 days in office. So yeah, just a couple things about JFK that maybe you didn't know, even though he is somebody you probably heard of before. Kennedy's inaugural address, from the very beginning, he started challenging Americans. First off, he was the youngest president ever elected, so he challenges the youth in the United States to play a more active role in the United States. And he had that famous line in his inaugural address that's at the bottom of this one, this slide here. And he says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Basically just pushing Americans, especially the younger generation, which he saw himself to be a part of, to be more active in the United States government and the United States policy. So Kennedy's presidency gets off to a very rough start as far as the Cold War goes because he was, tall, dark, handsome, all that stuff we talked about. His wife was beautiful. He had two kids that were very young, so it was the first time we had young kids in the White House. And this will go down in a lot of people's minds as the Camelot years in the White House, which basically gives this idea of a modern day Camelot and the mythical court of King Arthur back in the day. And basically, the first time that the press was really paying attention to the president. This is an interesting thing. I'm kind of going off on a lot of tangents today, but I'll try to get back to it very quickly. But it's so interesting how JFK, what we know about him now is, maybe he had affairs with people as high profile in Hollywood as maybe Marilyn Monroe and things like this. But the press never really went after him. And if this were to happen nowadays, you just think even back to like Bill Clinton's presidency, when the whole Monica Lewinsky thing came out and he was having an affair, right? They went after him. The press, vilified him. and really went after him and tried to, really hurt his presidency. I wonder why that wasn't the case back here in the 1960s. One might say that it was because of the Cold War, right? Like the Cold War was going on, and we did not want to look weak at all. And if we kind of went after JFK for some of his shortcomings as a husband or a father or something like that, that maybe it would make our leader look weak, and that we might look weak to the Russians, and that's a no-no at this point. I don't know, but it's just interesting how that has changed, right? It was almost like the press in the 1960s did everything they could to cover up this stuff that JFK did with his personal life, and didn't really dive into his personal life at all. And now we're sitting here, in 2020, and TMZ and everybody else would be going all after the president if they had some of these things going on that JFK did. So yeah, really interesting. But back to my point that I was talking about, his presidency getting off to a very rough start. Cuba was the main reason for the rough start. Cuba had a leader called Fidel Castro. Maybe you've heard his name as well. Remember, Cuba is only 90 miles away from Florida, so this is a very close country to the United States. And when Fidel Castro gets power, he basically openly declares Cuba as a communist country and himself as a communist leader. And he even welcomes aid from the Soviet Union, with them being a communist country. This is very uncomfortable for all Americans, and especially our new president, John F. Kennedy. What is he going to do about this? Well, when John F. Kennedy takes the presidency, and this is a huge point in his presidency, he is advised that there was a plan set in motion with Dwight Eisenhower, the previous president, who is, once again, I want to say this again, a war hero, knows everything about the military, definitely knows way more about the military than this young kid JFK would. And all of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is the head of the Navy and the head of the Army and head of all the armed forces, right? They advise him, and they probably use this kind of tone, right? Hey, kid, right? We had this plan set in place under Dwight D. Eisenhower. You might know him. He's got a lot more bells and whistles and decorations on his chest than you do as being a war hero. And he had this plan set in place where we were going to train Cuban exiles to go in there, start an uprising, and overthrow Fidel Castro. That was the idea. And on April 17th, 1961, they get the go-ahead, reluctantly, from John F. Kennedy to go ahead with this plan, to take 1,500 or so Cuban exiles, train them in the United States, and then send them back to Cuba to start this uprising that hopefully would get other people involved and get more people, protesting this communist form of government, and overthrow Fidel Castro so we don't have to worry about communism in Cuba anymore. It failed horrifically. It was awful. Not only did the exiles get pushed back, they basically fumbled over themselves even getting to the coast of Cuba. Like, they got hung up on like some coral reefs and got caught, and it got out that the United States was involved in this, and it just was an ugly, ugly look for us, and was a really huge black eye with JFK and his presidency, really before it even gets started. Like, he's barely, taken office by this point. So I want you to file this away, because later on, when we get to the defining moment of JFK's presidency, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis, he is going to have this ingrained distrust of a lot of his military leaders for this reason right here, because of the Bay of Pigs. And he will rely less on those military leaders, and maybe not even listen to them in some cases, and rely more on people that have been there with him through the entire process of getting elected as president, like his brother, Robert F. Kennedy. Okay, so let's move on. Let's get to that Cuban Missile Crisis, because this, like I said, is the defining moment of JFK's presidency. In October 1962, little over a year after that Bay of Pigs debacle, right, we have a spy plane take photographs of Cuba, and we see that they are setting up missile sites. And as soon as these photos come back and they are analyzed to in fact show that there are missiles being installed in Cuba, everything goes haywire. Like, we are on high alert, because now there are missiles within striking distance of almost the entire mainland United States. Like, this is a very dangerous situation, and we know for a fact the Soviet Union is behind it. We know this, right? Now, are we all clean in this? No. We have Jupiter missiles in Turkey, okay, which is within striking distance to the Soviet Union. So it's not like we don't have this, over there in Europe and Asia either. It's just the fact that they are now doing it to us. So there is this huge debate as to how to handle this, right? And once again, I want you to think back to that Bay of Pigs invasion. He has almost this ingrained distrust of his military leaders now. A lot of the military leaders are suggesting military action, right? Invading Cuba, maybe bombing Cuba, taking out those missile sites, so on and so forth, right? Well, if that happens, think about what we talked about with this Cold War idea, massive retaliation. I mean, if we shoot the first shot, this could set off a chain reaction with nuclear war happening, right? So he pumps the brakes on that and basically says, that's not the route I want to go. And instead, he basically, comes out with this blockade idea. Okay, in October 22nd, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade, and a lot of people saw this as a pretty weak move, right? But what his idea was is he would block any of those ships coming in, especially from the Soviet Union, to Cuba, so that these missile sites could not be finished or finalized. And even though we knew they were getting close to being finalized, we thought that this might, at least slow the process or stop it from getting fully completed, right? So he also demands that the Soviets remove the missiles. And Khrushchev promised to challenge the blockade, calling it outright banditry, saying that you don't control the seas, especially around Cuba. That's not your area. And basically, it comes down to this point where the Soviets are coming right at the blockade. And at the last minute, before any shots are fired, the Soviets do peel off. And here's an example, of what might have happened if we did have, that distinct possibility at the time of nuclear war happening. I told you about all those bomb shelters and those drills that kids were doing for nuclear war in the Cold War. It had never been to the point where it was going to be a more real possibility than right here, right now during this Cuban Missile Crisis. And as you can see, this is a famous photograph taken of JFK during those 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he is just like hoping that he made the right decision, right? Well, in fact, suddenly many of the Soviet ships stopped short of the blockade, did not challenge the blockade like we thought that Khrushchev might. And the famous line that was talked about with Secretary of State Dean Rusk that kind of summed up the entire naval blockade idea was, as the Soviets were coming closer and closer to the blockade, and we didn't know if we were going to have to force them to stop and turn them around, or if the Soviets were actually going to stop. When the Soviet ships started stopping and turning around, Dean Rusk said, "We're eyeball to eyeball with them," and I think the other fellow just blinked. So Khrushchev does back down. There's kind of this back channel communication between the Kennedys and Khrushchev, where we secretly, this never became public, secretly said that we would get our missiles out of Turkey, our Jupiter missiles out of Turkey, if they would take their missiles out of Cuba. And so it was kind of this for that agreement. But we basically said to Khrushchev, if you ever make this public that we agreed to do this, we will vehemently deny it, right? And it never really did become public, but we did eventually take those missiles out of Turkey. So that is kind of the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but, turns out to be not a big deal, but boy, it could have been a huge deal. I know you guys are all sitting home in quarantine right now. You don't have much to do, a lot of Netflix going on. If you guys have the ability to find the movie 13 Days, it is a fantastic movie about this very scenario, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So 13 Days. Got Kevin Costner in it, Bobby Kennedy, JFK, all those guys are in that movie, and it kind of talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis as a whole. So just a couple more things, and I'm finished up here, guys. Probably one of the higher points of the Kennedy presidency was his foreign trip that he took to Berlin to basically recommit to West Berlin and West Germany as being the capitalist countries, the capitalist controlled areas of Berlin and Germany. And to be honest, speaking outrightly against East Berlin and East Germany, which was controlled by the Soviets and was communist at the time. And he basically said at the speech that he gave at the Berlin Wall, "Ich bin ein Berliner." And basically that means, I am a Berliner. I am one of you guys. We are fighting this with you. We are part of you. And basically saying that we have this solidarity with you people that are, that are kind of under our protection, or at least under our command, right? So that was probably one of the higher points of his presidency. And we'll get into all this stuff that he did later with his legislative programs for medical care for the elderly. JFK also pushed very hard for civil rights. Now, a lot of his civil rights legislation did not get passed before he was assassinated. Some people even think that his pushing of civil rights is one of the things that led to his assassination. We don't know. We'll talk about his assassination next time. But this was basically the nuts and bolts of his presidency. So we'll talk about the assassination next time. And until then, see you guys later.